Well, I think like a lot of BGC faculty, I consider myself a searcher. I've moved through a lot of different majors, a lot of different concentrations, a lot of different interests to end up here. I started as a biology major, moved through anthropology, history, and I ended up as an undergraduate in American studies. And that's really where I was first exposed to the idea of using multiple disciplines to study the same period. So that was an interdisciplinary program that involved art history, literature history, and including material culture. And that was really my first exposure to that. I then studied in England, focusing on the European antecedents of the American colonial period that I'd focused on before, and decided then to go on and get a PhD in art history, still unsure whether I would work on American or European material. And it was in that process that I ended up in 18th century Rome, which got me heavily into the archives and some of the questions that I'm still dealing with today. So material culture and the questions of objects as evidence of past beliefs, societies, organizations, has really been actually a constant despite all those changes. I find the BGC such an interesting place because what I did at the margins of all of those different fields is here at the center. I think I share with my faculty colleagues a desire to root historical inquiry in real objects, real things, and real people. And I find being at the BGC tremendously exciting for that reason. Well, the most recent project I did, the most recent thing that appeared in print, was an archival project that relates to my bigger interest in the questions of display and collecting, and especially the strategic reuse of antiquities in the early modern period. So this was a study of a collection of casts in plaster, after ancient statues mostly, but including some modern materials, that was assembled in the mid-18th century for a pioneering educational institution in Bologna called the Istituto delle Scienze e delle Arti. And I spent some time in the archives there reconstructing basically the story of this idea of assembling a collection of casts to use as teaching tools. In a sense, it was like their version of an object lab. And what I found so interesting in the archives is that it details, in a sense, it's like the history of any educational or academic institution with academic politics. And what I learned was that there were different factions within the institute that debated and had different visions of how these teaching tools would be used, some wanting them to be restricted for student use, some wanting them really to function as a kind of publicly oriented museum. So in telling the story and tracing the kind of complicated path that this collection took from the initial idea through all of the molding and the transportation, and then the installation, different ideas about the installation, I was able to recapture these competing visions and how it actually settled then. One of the projects, the bigger project that I'm working on now, is related in the sense that I'm trying to follow objects through different stages of their life cycle. If the Bologna project was about the moment that acknowledged masterpieces were reproduced and diffused as educational tools, this bigger project returns to the question of how the originals were treated at a time that antiquities of all kinds, especially ancient statues, were regarded as, the height of cultural achievement, and really models for contemporary practice. So I'm returning to my work on the history of the Vatican Museum and the Vatican art collections. And I'm focusing in particular on the life history, as it were, of a group of statues that were uncovered in a clandestine dig outside of Tivoli in the 1770s, at a moment that everyone was digging up every piece of ground they could get their hands on in Italy, hoping to find buried treasure. And then how these passed through the Roman legal system, ended up the subject of a lawsuit, were eventually acquired by the papacy, and really used as the anchor of a major new installation. And what I've argued, and what I'll argue in this book, is that this was quite possibly the first time that a purpose-built museum room was constructed around a specific nucleus of artifacts. And that opens then all sorts of questions. What should museums look like? We take museums for granted, but in a sense, the publicly oriented museum was a new institution in the 1770s. And then all sorts of corollary questions about what these objects meant to the different communities that interacted with them, from tourists, foreigners, to, very important for my study, the varieties of Roman artisans and people of all strata of society who are, in a sense, feeding their families off of the interest in these statues. So it's a museological project, but it's also a project about the various meanings of antiquities for a broader audience than I think we've studied so far. Well, this particular room was opened in 1778 or 9. The whole Vatican Museum complex was finished around 1790 or so, when they kind of laid the final stone. It was open to the general public, any and all comers, during Holy Week. And then during the rest of the year, if you were reasonably well dressed and had a letter of introduction, you could get in, and there was a sort of staff of guards, and in a way a kind of material culture that grew up around the process of exhibiting and display. So I find in the archives documents for the preparation of paper labels, underneath the works of art. This is not a feature of exhibits in a princely realm, where in a sense it's the furnishings of a private palace to which members of the public might be admitted. This was a museum that really had as its original mission to, in some ways, educate the public, domestic, especially foreign, and provide models for the production of contemporary art that would be, as morally and aesthetically excellent, right, as these great models from antiquity. And what makes my statues particularly interesting is this is also the moment that they were identified as specifically Greek, and that was beginning to be differentiated culturally from Roman antiquity. So what Greece meant as a cultural referent at this period is hotly contested, as you can imagine. And that's what makes this moment so interesting to me. Well, my work's changed a lot since I've been at Bard Graduate Center. I've brought some interests with me. In fact, some of the projects that I'm working on are building on things that I started before coming here, but I'm aware every day that I'm thinking about them in a very different way, and I hope to think about them in a much richer way and a deeper way. It's a little embarrassing to look back and realize some of the very simplistic ideas that I had before coming to the Bard Graduate Center. I regard being here as a constant challenge. I learn from my students, I learn from colleagues, I learn from the dozens, hundreds of speakers and specialist scholars who come through this place every year. So to me, it's a feast, it's a smorgasbord. So I like to think that the projects that I do are informed by completely different questions now. I think I'm much more aware of the materiality of the things that I study. But it's also brought me into entirely new geographic areas. In some ways, the chance to work on the Spanish and Portuguese settlements in the Americas has brought me back in a way to where I started as an American Studies major. But I think I'm a much better scholar of American Studies now, having a broader view of what the Americas actually are. In fact, just came today from a wonderful class session with some local collectors who opened their home and their collection of South American colonial arts of all kinds to the class that I'm doing now on Viceregal America's visual and material culture. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is something I would never have done before coming to Bard Graduate Center, and it's a collaboration with a colleague at NYU on silver ship-shaped incense boats. This was a paper that we presented at a conference in Abu Dhabi on the nomadic object, and we're looking at case studies of these navetas, or naviculi, these ship-shaped incense boats, as examples of global religious material culture, objects that are superficially similar throughout the world as a result of European expansion, but what we're discovering is that they meant radically different things in the different local contexts in which they were used. It's a crazy topic. It's something I began knowing nothing about it, but I think that kind of freedom to just try something completely new, ask totally different questions, get your feet wet, master a bibliography, talk to specialists, put things together in exciting new ways. That, to me, is what the Bard Graduate Center is all about, and that's why I love being here.